Hey everyone, welcome to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bacasa, and the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast aims to bring the best stories and tips. Stories and tips from those that truly make an impact within the sport of fly fishing. I'll dig into the past, present, and future of our guests, uncovering their amazing story and journey. Join me each week as I interview a new guest from somewhere around the globe. If you're not yet a subscriber, help by subscribing now so I can attract the most influential guests and sponsors to the podcast. Let's make this the top fly fishing specific podcast available. Today's show is brought to you by the following sponsors. Angler's Coffee, a brand of coffee for anglers by anglers. Owner Joan Monahan grew up fly fishing, and after spending 40 years in the coffee industry, perfecting blend and brew process, he retired to creating a coffee blend and brand for the sport of his passion. Go to www.anglerscoffee.com and pick up a bag of your choice. My personal favorite is the pre-ground caddis blend. It has a perfect balance of body, aroma, and acidity to kickstart my day. Thank you, Anglers Coffee, for supporting the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. We look forward to supporting you and your business. Again, www.anglerscoffee.com. Dupa Fish, that's D-U-P-E-A fish.com, www.dupafish.com. Coming soon, but head over now, pre-register, and make sure you are ready to receive all the notices of the great deals that we'll be having coming your way. With years of accumulated DIY, Todd and I have traveled and booked experience all over the globe. We know how hard it is to customize a trip to you and your group's particular needs. We will have a comprehensive list of service providers and guides to help you in selecting the perfect trip for your and your party's needs. Book a trip with us and have the adventure of a lifetime. That's Dupa Fish, www.dupafish.com. Togen's Fly Shop, a family-owned business that focuses on delivering top-notch service on high-quality, affordable products for your fly tying needs. Go to www.togensflyshop.com. That's T-O-G-E-N-S flyshop.com. And pick up the materials you need to refill your fly box. Thank you, Togen's Fly Shop. We really look forward to supporting you and your family-owned business. Again, www.togensflyshop.com. Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is Christian Bacasa, your host of the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. Today, we have a fantastic guest, someone that's world-renowned for fishing in the Seychelles and knows that place inside and out. He's actually been quite the pioneer in that area, developing it and building strategies and tactics to attack some of the most incredible fishing in the world. Keith Rosenis on the line. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Christian. Great to be here.
Keith, I am just ecstatic to have this conversation. This is a dream location for a lot of people, and you've, as I've mentioned, certainly been the pioneer in that area and other areas around the world as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your history in fly fishing and how you got introduced to that area?
Yeah, so it's obviously a long-time passion of mine. I've been in fly fishing my whole life. I grew up as a very young individual, around the age of 5, learning how to cast with my grandfather, was quite a well-known fly fisherman. I grew up in South Africa, and under his watchful eye, progressed and fished, all the way until I actually left home. My grandfather is someone who came from Scotland, and he ended up after the war in Rhodesia. So he had a lot of fly fishing experience, and then it obviously the bug bit. I always knew I was going to be in fly fishing, so even though I did study and go to university and so forth, I still knew I was going to end up in fly fishing. And my road sort of progressed. After leaving school and studying, I decided that I was going to go to Farlows of Pall Mall, which is the oldest fly fishing store in Europe, which is in London. And I worked there for a couple of years, meeting people, learning different things and how to approach people and so forth. And then from there, moved into a full-time guiding career, doing back-to-back seasons in Russia and the Seychelles. And over the years, I've been fortunate enough to spend spend more than half a year in the Seychelles every year. And the business is going strong, and the fisheries are being protected, and the fishing is as good as it's ever been. And I was lucky enough to fish a lot of the outer islands as the first fly fisherman to ever fish them. I know that some of them had been fished before, whether it was with fly or not, but quite a few of them had never been fished. So yeah, I've had more luck on my side than anything else.
Yeah, that's typically how it is. It's those serendipitous moments that usually lead to opportunity. But you got to capitalize on that, man. Congrats to you. That sounds like a great upbringing and quite the adventure. So let me ask you this: did you start fishing for trout and salmonoids and then move into the saltwater arena, or did you start in saltwater?
I started in freshwater, fishing for trout, as most people do. Obviously, then moving on to sort of saltwater estuaries in our area of South Africa. And then when I was a youngster, I was very lucky. My father took me to the Seychelles, and I had an experience where we went on a liverboard boat. It was a small liverboard boat, and there was my father and three other of his friends.
When you say young, how young were you at this time?
About 17 years old.
Oh, yeah, that's perfect.
When first trip to the Seychelles. And the deal was that I had to go to the island every day and remain on the island while they would game fish around the island. So it suited me just fine. I rocked up there with a 2-to-1 gear ratio salmon reel and New Zealand Killwolf 7-weight fly rod with my Maxima 22-pound monofilament and flies tied on stainless steel mustard hooks with as much flashing as possible, and basically just got dumped on the shore in the Amarantes, like an island called Seychelles, and kind of figured it out for myself. And it all progressed from there. So it was a baptism of fire, and seeing all these different fish in shallow water. In those days we were just fresh out of apartheid, so we wouldn't have any reading material. There were no guides in the Seychelles. Seychelles was relatively new, so it was very much a learn yourself kind of curve. And it progressed from there onwards.
So on that first experience, I mean, you're dropped off, you're a young kid, right? And you got all the energy in the world. When you were dropped off, was it, I just can't imagine the scenery and the imagery. I mean, were there fish right away that you were spotting and seeing and going, oh my gosh, and making casts to them? Or was it more of like I got to search and hunt scenario? Can you walk through how that day went?
It was almost instantly. I mean, I rocked up on the shore and straight away I saw tailing bonefish. It took me a hell of a long time to figure out how to catch them. Obviously, without knowing, how to present to a bonefish, you generally spook them, when they're in shallow water. And plus, on top of that, you're fishing 22-pound Maxima monofilament, which isn't that invisible.
Yeah.
But I mean, after a couple scares and misses and hookups and so forth, you eventually learn the way. And as the tide sort of generally comes in, you follow the tide, and then you see some other species. I never actually saw any GTs in my first trip, but I did see permit, and I obviously cast every single thing that I had at the permit for them not even to look at it.
Yeah.
So it was a big learning curve. You didn't realize the tides, the movement of the tides, how the tides would move, the vastness of the movement. So it was, also at times that, it could have been quite dangerous. So I was lucky that I grew up in South Africa. I'm a very good swimmer. So I did end up swimming on a few occasions. But yeah, it was wonderful. I mean, I couldn't have had a better baptism, to the Seychelles, just going out there and trying to figure it out for yourself, every single second, you're recording it in your brain. You can't believe your luck that you're on this magnificent atoll and you're there by yourself, not one single person with you, and hear all these fish and you're trying to figure it out. So it was great. It was a great way to learn how to solve problems and to figure out a fish, being thrown in the deep end right in the beginning.
Yeah. And, so many of us have that problem solving passion or element to ourselves, right? That's why you get into fishing, is you never really fully solve the problem, I think. Yeah, that's what keeps bringing us back. It's cool to hear. So you talked about the tidal influx. What is the tidal influx like for the Seychelles area?
Depending on which tides you're on, obviously the spring tides, you have much bigger fluctuations, but your tidal swing can be 2.5 meters. So, and it comes in fairly quick. So, for instance, if you're fishing on the outer atolls, the ones which are like Cosmolito and a Stove, the water really rushes in. It flows in like a river. And if you imagine an atoll, so you have the water can fill from both areas because you have a lagoon, which it fills in from the inside, and you have obviously the sea, which it fills in from the outside. And once it hits the apex and the water from inside and outside join, you get an extremely fast sort of increase in depth. And that's when people generally get in trouble. But that's also the reason why, the giant trevally love the flats, is because they love that influx of water, and they love that sort of rushing of cool water in over warm water, which generally stuns the bait fish and gives them all sorts of feeding opportunities.
Okay. Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So that tidal influx, it's the temperature change in the water that really kind of gets the, excuse me, the bait fish and or just bait in general, whether it's crabs, et cetera, kind of moving around and triggering that feeding frenzy.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the one thing you learn very quickly when you're on the flats is that certain species of fish prefer different kinds of temperatures. So, for instance, the warmer parts of the year, so summer months, it's generally GT fishing because the giant trevally love warm water. They want warm water. And then the bonefish and the other species prefer cooler water. So, it's sometimes, you find that, when you have your best catches around all different kinds of species, it's generally the beginning of the season and the end of the season. If you want your best, GT fishing is generally normally the middle period of the season. So yeah, it's there's so many different species to catch in the Seychelles, and you're always getting your opportunities to all the different species. But there is better periods for certain species.
What's your favorite species to target these days?
It's a tough one for me. I love them all. So,
Yeah.
I cut my teeth catching bonefish, and I love catching bonefish, especially the singles and doubles. But there's so many other species in the Seychelles. Giant trevally, the ferocity of the take. That they're pushing the boundaries to catch a 125 centimeter plus GT. Then you have obviously the finickiness of the triggerfish, where they're so spooky, but they're also so technical in the way that you can finally entice them to eat the fly, and then when they eat the fly, they bite the hook in half and they disappear down the hole.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you obviously have then you have the milkfish, which they feed in really good sort of feeding patterns offshore, and you can cast to 6 million milkfish and not catch one.
Yeah.
And once you catch your first one, understand how it works, you can hook 7 in a row in 7 casts. So it's all those different technicalities which make it really interesting for me. And obviously, at the end of the road, or right up there, the holy grail is in the Pacific permit for me. You could have, as you could have 1,000 perfect casts, and he just won't eat. And then something changes, and he turns around, eats the fly, and you've got him on. So, yeah, there's so many different things that I love. The beauty of the Seychelles is that you have so many different species in close proximity. You can catch a bonefish on the flats, and within 5 minutes, literally, you can be teasing for sailfish. So yeah, it's amazing. It really is an amazing place. Once you sort of had your fill of one species, you can move on to the next.
Yeah. I got a question for you. Maybe some tips for me. I've been, had a chance to target some milkfish down in Mexico, and we were fishing more of like an algae type fly. I had one hookup, but instantly came unbuttoned. What are some of the presentation tactics that you're using there for milkfish?
Yeah, so the most important thing is obviously you don't want to strip the fly. You want the fly to remain static. But you also don't want to leave it static in a way that you have slack line and you can't feel the eat. Because as quick as a milkfish inhales the fly, it exhales the fly. So what I like to do is I like to set up if you're on a boat, I like to set up on a drift where the fish will be coming towards you, but they won't be coming straight on towards you. They'll be coming almost at a 90-degree across to you. So you can cast at a 45 degrees to them. Rather than, and you have numerous shots at them, as they come past the boat. Now, the scenario is the most important thing about milkfish. If you can get milkfish where they're feeding in a line, significant numbers of them, in multi different layers, so i.e., the fish on the surface, then fish underneath them, and fish below them, and so forth, and the fish at the front come past you, and what they do is they then turn around and they come feeding back up the line, and they meet other fish coming the opposite way. So you have fish feeding different ways.
And maybe you can describe that too, because I don't know if our listeners have ever seen feeding milkfish. I mean, my experience was it was thousands of milkfish. Is that what you're seeing as well? Like huge pods of these milkfish working?
Yeah, huge pods. Like, I mean, not so wide in a sense, but normally working on sort of scum lines in a feeding lane. So all feeding in a lane. They generally follow each other, along this lane. And then when they get to some area where there's not so much algae or whatever it is they're feeding on, they'll generally turn around and feed back down that lane. And that's what you want. You want huge numbers because you basically want to have as many casts as you can in front of these fish, with one actually eating the fly. But one of the most important things is that, you're often seeing the milkfish on the surface with their mouths out the water, and we call it when they milkshake, and they sort of, you get like a sound, almost like a sound of them feeding, and they're making like a bubble trail in the water. That's what you want to see, but those aren't the fish you're catching. You're catching the fish that are below that, and you've got to figure out which fish are below that you're going to catch. Some you might get the fish on the surface. There might be sort of a couple feet break, and then you have the fish below that are feeding on different plankton or algae or whatever it is they're feeding on. So you've got to try and see where those fish are going to feed. If you fish for the fish on the surface for a significant amount of time and you haven't had one, you're not going to get one. So what you need to do is then you can weight your fly, change your presentation slightly different, and obviously get your fly to an area where you think you're going to be able to hook one of those fish. And it's almost like cracking the code. It's almost instant when you figure it out. And once you've got that, then you know how to catch them, and you'll catch them one after another. For us, we will fish with a sort of a container of tungsten beads, different weights of tungsten beads. And what we generally do is we will tie a tungsten bead onto the eye, the protection loop, if we need to get down a little bit. If the fish are right down, we'll even fish with 2 tungsten beads and get it right down into them, and you'll get a hookup. You'll get a hookup. The next issue you have is obviously, sometimes they're not.
Let me interrupt you real quick. So you're using a fly that's like a zero balance, right? It just floats, but then you're adding that extra tungsten bead to get to the right column of water of where those fish are feeding in the manner that you want. Is that, am I understanding you correctly there?
Yeah. Exactly. The fly we're using sinks very slowly. It's almost like a neutral density sort of fly. It just sinks fairly slowly. It needs to look natural, as if something's falling in the water and now it's sinking slowly. Okay. And that's what you need to get. But now, obviously when you're fishing the bead, don't be scared to make sure you're tight. So if you cast the fish, you got to actually almost strip the fly to stay in contact, because that fish will pick it up and you won't even feed it. And if you feel anything, you've got to come tight immediately. Even if it was an airstrike, it doesn't matter. Just if you feel a little bump, just come tight, and you've got him in the mouth, and you don't even realize it.
Yeah,
you're actually hooking quite a few fish without even knowing.
Okay, and then it's off to the races. I mean, can you describe the fight of these? They're very well known for being just tremendous fighters.
Yeah, pound for pound, it's like creating a large bonefish and adding a bigger tail to it. So, it's instantaneous. Once you hook him, he's instantaneous, and generally they don't give you much time to sort of steady yourself. So you've got to have your line ready. You've got to have your line free of any snags. And the idea is to obviously try and get the fish onto your reel as fast as possible. But it's the one fish where I do encourage almost like a side strike, trout strike, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I like to come out onto the fish and then give it 2 or 3 really good pulls, because you want to get that hook buried in the beginning of the fight. If it's a shallow hook and you haven't got that hook buried in the beginning of the fight, it can tear out quite easily. So I generally give it a couple of nice pulls, and then he'll generally clear onto the reel quite quickly, and then the fish will be at the stage where he thinks he's a milkfish or a tarpon, and he'll greyhound a couple of times. And then you go into various different phases of the fight, where if you're lucky, you can get that fish to the boat within 10 minutes or so. And if you can get that fish anywhere near the net, you can generally land it when it's extremely green. But if you do attempt to land in the first 10 minutes and you miss that net chance, generally you're in for an hour. As you know, there is a rumor that they don't have a lactic acid buildup. We don't know if it's proven or not. We intend proving it in this next season when we do some tests, blood tests on these fish, but they are said to not have any lactic acid buildup, so therefore they don't get tired. They've got a gill rakers or covers that are exactly the same as bonefish, where they don't meet each other and stop. They actually fold over each other. Then they obviously are perfectly shaped like a bullet. Now they've got that casing of their eyes, and they've got this massive tail. So it's a perfect shape for a hard fighting fish. And then then you add to it, then they're smart. They know exactly where all the coral is. So if you're inside the lagoon, they're going to find the coral. So you have to get on top of the fish. But they go through a period where they think they're a milkfish or a tarpon. They jump a couple of times, and they think they're a giant trevally. And they look for different kinds of structure to cut you off. And then they think they're a yellowfin tuna, and they go straight down. So it's not uncommon to have someone, a guest, sit on a fish for 2 hours and lose it. It's not uncommon for guests to land a milkfish after 3 hours. You generally get certain fish that we call devil fish that you just can't lift, and no matter what you do with a 9 or 10 weight rod, there's nothing you can do. You just got to pull as hard as you can. And there's others that come to the boat within 10, 15 minutes, and you manage to get the net under them. But generally, a fish that is fought under an hour is a nightmare to photograph. It's green, it's still got a lot of fight in it. So I kind of encourage my guests to give the fish at least half an hour to 45 minutes, and then it's at least easy for me to handle the fish and for us to get a nice photograph.
Oh, wow. It just sounds incredible. You touched a little bit on some of the science and biology behind the fish, and it sounds like you do quite a bit of work in that arena. Who do you work with in that arena, and how are you going about that? Maybe you can fill us in there a little bit.
Yeah, so we've been working with Andy Danichak from Keep Fish Wet and UMass and Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. We've got a telemetry study set up in the Alphonse archipelago, whereas we've got a lot of listening stations underwater, and we've got 80 odd giant trevally, which we've put acoustic tags in their bellies. And we're getting a significant amount of data as to whether we're putting too much pressure on the fish, the movement of the fish, mortality of the fish, and just to make sure that we're being responsible, with the fishery. And funny enough is we figured out, well, we haven't figured out, the data shows us that we have a low mortality rate, extremely low mortality rate, almost nothing, and we have an extremely low recapture rate. And the fish are still alive and swimming around because they're being pinged at all the different stations, moving around and eating as they do. And so it's quite encouraging to see that we're not putting a lot of pressure on the fish, and we've got an extremely healthy population of giant trevally. And 90%, 95% of the fish that are coming onto the flats are new fish, and we're not recapturing those fish. So it's a remarkable experience to be a part of. We've now have just signed off our next proposal, which is we're going to be doing the acoustic tagging of milkfish to see if they are resident all year round, and to see what their movements are, to find out if these fish are actually moving to other places, and are they being affected in other places. If they disappear for a large portion of the year, we know that they're going to UAE countries or something like that, and where they could be targeted. At the same time, we're going to do blood samples and see if this rumor of the no lactic acid buildup in milkfish is true. So we've got a substantial amount of research projects on the go all the time, but our operation is quite unique in the sense that it's mostly funded by fly fishing. All the different atolls which we fish at, and we don't only protect the fishery, we actually protect the terrestrial as well. So the amount of funds which we donate to research and conservation is equal for terrestrial as marine. So we help through the fly fishing that we have at these destinations. We're managing to protect the birds and the turtles and the tortoises and all the creatures that are synonymous with the outer atolls of the Seychelles.
That's just fantastic. So let's just take a minute there to recognize, it sounds like you have quite a few sponsors and people within the fly fishing community that are supporting that and funding that. Let's name some of those off if you can. And our audience is really, I think, very good at adopting those types of brands and supporting them in effort to help with these kind of things. So who helps you with that right now, Keith?
Well, first of all, I mean, obviously all the anglers, every angler or every person that comes to one of our destinations donates $25 per person per day, which then goes to the foundation and is then obviously put into the projects. So with all the anglers that come out, so obviously that's number one, the number one people we'd like to thank. And then obviously the collaborations we've had with various other for instance, UMass, Andy Denachek, and then Bonefish and Tarpon Foundation Trust, sorry. And then we've had, obviously we get support from Yeti, from Costa, from Patagonia, all the various different brands, out there, Thomas and Thomas, Shilton, Cortland, all the different brands that help us create awareness for the different projects that we're doing. And then obviously, the most important thing is the foundations which do the work. So Island Conservation Foundation, and then the government, which is Island Development Company, which helps us. And it's a big group effort.
Mm-hmm.
We all put it all together. It's nice to see so many people that are dedicated to conservation and conservation of places which they aren't associated with. So over the years we've been working really hard on creating these marine protected areas, which are going to come into play very shortly through the government, through debt swap. So it's been a long road for me. Obviously in the beginning, I saw these destinations and all I wanted to do was show them to people. And my vision has now sort of evolved to an extent where now I know it's a cliche where you say, oh, well, we want to save these places for our children, but it has become that. It's the drive to now protect these places for many years to come, so that we know that these places are protected, and in 50 years' time, our children can come and fish them and enjoy them.
That's just fantastic. So take a minute here right now, just to say thanks. I appreciate it. I can't wait to get out there and explore the area. And I have dreams of bringing my two little girls out there when they're old enough to get around, have the experience to really enjoy it, and to hear the work that you guys are putting in is just absolutely fantastic, man. So thanks, Keith. Appreciate that.
Yeah, Christian, you mentioned your two little girls, and for me, it's amazing. My boy, I had the first real good fishing session with him last year, and we went out in the flats, and just to see the enjoyment, a young person gets out of these places. He walked onto the flats, and within 2 hours, he had landed 11 bonefish. Oh, wow. And it's just something else you're not going to be able to replicate anywhere else, and it gives you that passion to want to drive things a lot harder.
Yeah.
And you and your two daughters are most welcome any stage. To have you and your family out there, and for your daughters to see it, like my daughter sees it. See the turtles hatching in the morning. At any one stage when you're walking in the water, there's 50 turtles around you. Yeah. A lot of the joke that there's too many turtles. They're spooking our fish. So it's it really is a unique place.
Wow, just sounds fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about your business in the area, the lodge and guiding service, and how people can get a hold of you there.
Yeah, so our company is called Alphonse Fishing Company. You can get a hold of us on our website. You just Google Alphonse Fishing Company. So we've been around I've been in the Seychelles for 22 years. And the company's been around since September 2012. In the old days, I used to do everything on board liverboards. But, the issue with the liverboard is that you can't actually make a positive you can't adopt a positive approach at these atolls, because you'll go with the liverboard, you'll spend your time there, and when you've got clients, then you disappear and you leave the place to itself. So our focus was to create, sustainable areas. And so what we did is from September 2012, we adopted a policy of obtaining the leases at these destinations. And then through having the lease, we're able to generate, funds to create conservation efforts. So we have various leases on the outer islands of the Seychelles. Our really, really famous ones are obviously Alphonse and then Cosmolido. But we have numerous others. So we have Alphonse, which is a 12-rod destination. We have Cosmolido, which is a 12-rod destination. We have a Stove, which is a 4-rod destination. We have Farquhar, which is a 10-rod destination, and then we have the Amarantes, which is a 4-rod destination. So all various atolls a long way away from each other. Most of them are about 200 miles to 300 miles away from each other, so really spread out. And all of them are very different in the sense that they have slightly different numbers of species. So some atolls are better for certain species, better than the other atolls. So for instance, if you want to come for a real all-round experience, with a really good accommodation where you can bring your family and they can do all sorts of other activities, diving, snorkeling, eco tours and so forth, and or go to the spa, those kind of things, is Alphonse Island. And from Alphonse Island we fish St. Francois Atoll, which is really close to Alphonse Island, and it's uninhabited. So you get to, as a fisherman, you get to go and experience that for the day or for the week, and come back every single day, and your family are well taken care of. So it's not as hardcore as the other destinations, but it's a really all-rounded destination. It has all the species and great numbers of it. With focus on obviously bone fishing. Then we go to like the further outer atolls like Cosmolito, which is really well known for the numbers of giant trevally. There's no atoll in the world that has that amount of giant trevally. And very close to it is called a Stove Atoll, which has similar amounts of giant trevally. And then we move more to the east to Farquhar, which is similar amounts of giant trevally, but then you add a species called the bumphead parrotfish. So all the destinations are very different. All of them have lodges, and all the lodges are exclusive. There is nobody else in those lodges. There's only one lodge on each atoll. And then obviously at all the destinations we have professional fly fishing guides. It's turnkey. It's a turnkey experience. You arrive there, and we have everything from fishing tackle to professional guides and so forth. So it's a real upmarket, or let me say that again.
Yeah.
It's a real 5-star experience from the sense that everything's taken care of, and you have all the tuition from a well-trained guide. You can come out and not feel it won't feel daunting if it's your first experience. You'll get great tuition, and you just get out there and enjoy the stuff.
And so just to clarify for our audience, when you say it's a 10-rod destination or a 4-rod destination, you're meaning that's how many people we can facilitate in the guide service?
That's as many people as we will allow to be on the flats in one day.
Okay.
So we have our own rod limits in place. We don't want to put too much fishing pressure on these destinations.
Oh, okay. Perfect. So, Keith, what I'd love to hear is kind of break down your presentation on a couple different species. How you typically target them, what their habits are, et cetera. And then, this is the type of casting and stripping, et cetera. I'm thinking maybe like GTs, triggers, and then perhaps a surprise species. But before we do that, let's take a quick break, recognize our sponsors, and then we'll get back. Angler's Coffee. We love fueling your next cast. We've been roasting coffee before coffee was cool. www.anglerscoffee.com. Dupafish. Coming soon. Pre-register now and get notified. www.dupafish, that's D-U-P-E, a fish.com. And Togen's Fly Shop, a family-owned business for all your fly tying needs. That's Togen's Fly Shop, T-O-G-E-N-S, flyshop.com. Tactics that you use, and go from there. I think where I'd really like to start is what is your general outfit of gear when you head out onto the flats, or for that species, or whether it's from a boat, etc. So let's start with the GT and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, no problem. So the most important thing with obviously fishing the flats and places where there are various different species is to be ready. Time is never on your side. So your tackle needs to be rigged and ready to present to any kind of species that can sort of approach. Generally, your guide will give you an indication of what species you can potentially come across in those areas. But what we kind of do is we kind of gear around carrying the rods which you won't have time to change. I.e., so if you would carry like a GT rod, or you would carry like a permit fly or so forth, because you don't have time. You don't have much time to now go and change, because that fish is going to come towards you or go away from you and so forth. So Generally, we're fishing a 9-weight outfit and a 12-weight outfit. So the 12-weight outfit would generally be for giant trevally or barracuda if they're around. And then obviously the 9-weight would be for your triggerfish, bonefish, in a Pacific permit, and any other kind of small fish which are swimming around.
And you're fishing a warm water floating line on those, and then what kind of strength leaders are you using in lengths?
Yeah, so various leader strengths. The most important thing is the water is crystal clear, so you need to have something which is nice and clear in the water. All the lines are all saltwater tropic lines. We don't fish anything other than floating lines through the whole lot. So yeah, what I'll best do is I'll give you a rundown. So giant trevally are a tough species. They are the predators, super predators. So I'm a firm believer that when you're fishing for giant trevally, it's a tug of war. So you've got to try and break his spirit as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, you need a really sort of tough outfit. I fish a 12-weight outfit, quick taper 12-weight outfit, 9 foot. And I fished Thomas and Thomas, and I use the sextant fly rods. But any quick action fly rod, will work. And then I use, obviously you have to use a saltwater proof reel, something that has a really smooth and strong drag. I fish Shilton reels. And the reason why I fish Shilton reels is they can be easily repaired if there's any grit or salt or anything like that, which gets into reels. On those reels, I'll load them with, for giant trevally, I'll load them with a minimum of 300 yards of 80-pound gel spun or Spectra, whatever it is you would like to use. Something that's really robust and strong, that if it touches something, it's not going to part. Mm-hmm. I attach the braided running line or braided backing to the fly line with a braided loop, 50-pound braided loop, and or with doing obviously 120-pound backed up Spectra or something along those lines. I tie a Bimini to double surgeon. And then if we've got a Spectra or braided loop on the fly line, which is now knotted on, loop to loop, obviously, because you can change it. I tend to prefer that because you can change the lines, but it's also really strong. Okay. Any kind of knot from braid to fly line, like a perfection loop or anything like that, it's not going to work. It's going to break you in a matter of seconds. Any kind of blood knot or any kind of knot which is tying the Spectra straight or the braid straight to the fly line is not going to work. Okay. And unfortunately, welded loops don't work either. They tend to give up the ghost. So what we generally do is when a guest will arrive on location, we'll strip the entire outfit down and we'll put new loops on and new knots. So we know that as guides, one thing's been ticked, and you're not going to have tackle failure. Yeah, and there's nothing worse. You're upping
the strength on that braided line there at the end of your backing to. Is that so it doesn't cut into the fly line and strip it, or what's the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, it's so you don't. So if you join fly line straight to braid, your point of most. How can I say resistance or most they have the most effect will be at that join. If you're able to spread that sort of pressure out along a braided loop, for instance, but not a factory braided loop, it has to be a custom built braided loop with nail knots, you spread that shock across that whole area. Cortland does a hollow braid which you can double back. There's also obviously various different Kevlar loops that you can get. There's waxed running line, Cortland waxed running line, which people use 50-pound, which you can double over. The most important thing is the knot which you use on those, which needs to be a nail knot, and 2 of them. And then obviously on the other side, I like to use a Bimini to double surgeon, which also gives you a double up there. And then obviously, when that line or that fly line goes around a coral head, it's not going to break right at that point. It's going to give you some time to be able to get it off that coral head or, to unwrap it around, whatever it's been caught on. So that's the most important thing. There's nothing worse than hooking up on a GT, and as you go, you're clearing line, you just see you get through the fly line, next minute you see your fly line disappearing into blue yonder, and all you're sitting there is holding your braided backing. It's not a lot of fun.
Yeah, that would be absolutely heartbreaking.
Then obviously flyline wise, we like to use a solid weight forward, heavy weight forward line, because your fly is heavy, so you need to be able to turn it. So now anything with a solid core, if possible, anything above 50 pound core. I use Cortland GT Tuna, and there's various different lines which work, the scientific anglers and so forth, or airflow, and they work really well. So you've got to have a really strong core. And then on the front, we do the same thing as we put on a braided loop or doubled 120-pound hollow spectra, and then to a perfection loop of 120-pound mono. And the reason why I like to use mono versus fluorocarbon is because the mono is generally a little bit thinner. It's more flexible. It's got, for me, it's got better. It holds the knot better. Obviously a fluorocarbon will open up if you don't seat it properly.
Mm-hmm.
It does obviously slide a little bit more than fluorocarbon because there's a little bit more stretch. But for me, over the years, I've gone between various different forms of monofilament and fluorocarbon, and the best is definitely monofilament.
Mm-hmm.
Another reason why I use monofilament is because I don't want it to sink. I want that mono to be neutrally dense. I don't want it to sink like fluorocarbon sinks. Heavy fluorocarbon, 100-pound fluorocarbon sinks quite quickly, and it creates a bit of a jerk movement on your fly. When you're fishing in the Seychelles, it's obviously the water is very clear, so you're often going to have to lay that fly up. So you're going to have to cast maybe 2 or 3 or 4 fly rods head of the fish if it's a difficult fish onto sand, and you don't want that fly to sink immediately and sort of snag. So generally we casting a rod length ahead of the fish, but sometimes they can be difficult. So you want that flexibility,
Mm-hmm.
and also you don't want that fly to jerk. You don't want the fluorocarbon to sink, and then when you strip for the fly to sort of sink and then jerk up. You want sort of it to remain sort of straight,
okay,
in a sense.
Yep.
Even though you're stripping the fly at a ferocious speed. So monofilament is definitely better. And then on the other hand, if you're using monofilament and not fluorocarbon, if you're using a barrel head popper on the surface, you're not getting that sinking of the leader, which affects the pop as well.
Yep.
So monofilament's the way to go. I use like a zippy Suffix 120 pounds, so 1 millimeter is perfect, and that's my go-to for my 12-weight. I won't change it to anything else. I'll stick to that all the time. And the reason why we're fishing 120 pound is that giant trevally have a tendency to go around coral and any sort of sharp object. So you've got that ability to stop him. And funny enough, the smaller giant trevally generally will even bite you off on a 120-pound monofilament because they've got such small, sharp, conical teeth. And if if they swallow the fly and the leader moves from one side to the other side of the mouth, they can bite you off quite easily. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't go anything less than 120 pound. And then the fly, obviously, the most important thing about the fly is not the fly; it's the hook. You've got to have a real robust hook. We generally fishing gamagatsus between the 5/aught and the 8/aught. So real strong hooks that if you do hook them in the bony part, it's not going to open up. It's quite funny. Guys rock up with these magnificent fly boxes with the most amazing flies, and they just look at us in despair when we go through them and just say, can't use that, because it's got a mustard stainless steel hook, or it's got something that's just going to open up. It's just going to create despair when that fish eats the fly. It just opens the hook like a noodle.
And a gauge of the hook just isn't there.
Now,
are those hooks that you use? Are they like a circle hook scenario, or are they?
No.
Okay.
All just J hooks, either straight point or slightly incurved point. There's various different hooks you can use. TMCO's got some great hooks. You just got to make sure that they are really, really robust and strong.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is you take that hook, tie it to a 120-pound leader, and stick it on your door handle and give it a strong pull as hard as you can. And if it opens, it's no good.
Yep. Okay.
If it doesn't open, then it's fine. Then we obviously fish various different fly patterns for giant trevally. The bigger the better in some cases, but also in certain cases, small patterns also do work.
Now, are they bait fish patterns, crabs, shrimp, or a combination?
90% of the time it's bait fish patterns.
Okay.
So various different patterns, bait fish patterns. We tend to fish a lot of brush fly patterns because you can create a nice profile. The one important aspect of it is the way the fly swims. We've more recently we've started using a thing called a Hannibal mask, which is a mask which you tie into the hook, onto the hook, which allows you to use less fiber and creates more sort of profile in the fly. And it works really well. It's a company called Flybrush who manufacture them. And if you want to find out where you can get them from, you can get them from Flyman in the USA. He distributes it through the USA. That's quite an important thing, which is it's a new addition to our to what we use in the Seychelles now. The most important thing is obviously with giant trevally is you don't lift your rod. When you cast your fly anything between a rod length, 2 rod lengths, or even sometimes a little bit closer, he's going to decide whether he wants to eat that fly. And what you need to do is you need to strip it. Once he's decided, he's turned towards the fly, keep that fly moving away from him. Create it's cat and mouse in a sense, but a very fast mouse.
Now, are you tucking your rod and double hand, overhand stripping back as fast as you can, or what is that stripping presentation technique like?
Yeah, you can do that. I adopt a different style. Is where what I do is I will strip, and then what I do is while I'm stripping, I move my rod forward towards the fly line. So from a strip point where the rod is very close to my body, when I'm stripping with the other hand the line is on my finger, I'm sliding the rod forward. So by the end of my strip, my left hand is all the way back and my front hand is all the way forward.
Mm-hmm.
So that the reason for that is that once I take my hand off the strip, I've stopped the strip, I then pull my rod hand towards my body. So I'm creating movement with the hand.
Mm-hmm.
And at that stage, once my rod reaches my body, then my left hand is then on the line again. I'm creating a strip again. So it's almost like you create a constant movement. So it's quite a unique way to strip, and your fly is always moving. It doesn't hit any dead spots. And it's quite enticing for the giant trevally.
Yeah, and you're always in position to get that strip set, whether you're just pulling back on the rod while it's forward, or you're stripping with your left hand. You're not in that dead zone where your hand's back and you got to re-grab your line to get the strip set because you can't. You're in your belly.
So you always have tension on the line because the line's always moving.
Mm-hmm.
And then the most important thing is that don't lift your rod. I mean, often you'll see the GT eat the fly, but you won't feed him. He might have missed it. So you keep stripping. And once you come tight, don't lift your rod. Pull as hard as you can with both hands. They've got a tendency to close it in their teeth, and you think you've got him hooked, but he's just holding in his mouth.
And so at that point, that's like that jerk set, where you're really
as
looking to feel them and then give it a couple jerks maybe to set that hook even deeper and then clear your line.
Yeah, and then he's going to do it for you. So the important thing is keep the left hand away or the right hand away from the rod.
Yeah, I was just going to say, let's talk about that clearing of the line technique because very few hookups occur, right? For most people in saltwater, especially a lot of people who are trout fishermen. So what are the tactics? You talked about extending your left arm, I'm assuming, and really spreading it away from the reel and letting it run that way. Can you talk through that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the nice thing about giant trevally is quite often you're on foot. So your line will be lying in the water. So it's generally a lot easier than clearing line when you're on a boat, because, you don't often get that spaghetti. So what I'll generally do is once I strike the fish, I know he's tight, I'll move my stripping hand away from my body as far as I can. So, and don't put too much pressure on that line, because the more pressure you put on the line, the more it tends to shoot up. So just nice and soft hands, and get that line cleared towards the reel. Obviously, just at the whole time you're looking straight at the reel and looking at the line to see if there's any possible snags and so forth. And a really good trick to learn with GT fishing is that if you see that you've got a crow's nest or a bird's nest or whatever you want to call it, what I'll do is I'll get that into an area where I know I can't get it loose, and all I'll do is I'll pull the front section of my rod off at the first eye. So I'll let that snag go into the first eye, and then I'll let it go on the first run. Even if I'm just holding the reel on the butt end, it's no problem at all, because what it's going to do is it's going to give you some time to get everything cleared, and then you can actually run off the fish and wind up and get as close as you can to the sections of the rods, and you can clear that's crow's nest or whatever it is, and then continue with the fight.
Okay, so you're pulling the front end of your rod off because the nest that you've generated is going to go through the bigger eyelets, and then you just let your rod end go wherever it's going to go until you can get that back in towards you to work on it and clear it, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you don't do that, all that's going to happen is that crow's nest is going to go through the rod's eyes and pull all the eyes off, and you're going to be left with nothing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. All right, wow.
Broken line and no eyes.
I mean, I could just imagine the internal panic in that situation of 99.9% of the population of anglers. You just never been in that position, so that's pretty cool to hear. All right, so that's it. And then the fight, you said you're kind of putting some side pressure, you're changing angles and trying to get them in. How long is the fight typically, and what are some of the tactics or techniques you use there?
Giant trevally, people get a tendency or have a tendency to think that you have to have your drag extremely tight. Now, that's the worst thing to do, because all that's going to happen is that once you get that line, once that fish has been able to build up speed and you're going from the line onto your reel, you're going to have that startup inertia, and often you're just going to break it off. So what I'll generally do is I'll have a firm drag, but not too firm. So what I'll do is I'll generally clear my line, and once my reel has started turning, I'll then give it the clicks to slow the fish down. So I'll come down tight. And then what generally happens is that fish will head off and look for structure immediately. And if you're able to sort of keep slowing it down, almost like, a couple clicks at a time, keep it slowing down. Eventually, if you can get that fish to do a somersault or a nose stand, as we call it, you've got a good chance of that fish not going out too far, and you've got a good chance of landing that fish. Generally, if you're able to do that, he's going to come straight towards you and look for coral closer to you, and which he can do and cut you off closer by. So what I would do is I'll generally apply quite a bit of pressure in the beginning, but without putting too much pressure that you're going to break him off. You don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. And then once you stop that first run, I'll come back off the drag a little bit and wind back and get back and nice and tight. And then if he goes on another run, I'll then do the same thing again, because you don't want to have that startup inertia too many times, because all that's going to happen is you're going to end with the parting of the line. Giant trevally don't have extremely long fights. The fights are extremely very long if you give them too much line and they're able to get out of the drop off.
Okay.
It's a matter of getting them all the way back. Generally, a 1 meter plus fish doesn't need to take more than 150 to 200 yards of line maximum. No more than that. That is a hell of a lot of line. A fish are 125 centimeters or big, they can take a couple of 100 yards of line, but you can still stop him in time.
And how many runs will they make?
Generally 2 or 3 runs.
Okay.
No more than that. And then after that, it's just a bit of dog, and you've got to sort of, I'm a firm believer in if you can follow the fish, follow it. So keep walking towards the fish as much as you can. Don't let too much line get out. The more line you have in the water, the more problem you're going to have with him possibly snagging something.
Yep.
So I like to run after my fish or get as close as I can to that fish, and then generally you have a better chance of landing them. And the most important thing is that when you obviously have a giant trevally close to you and want to land him, they've got really sharp scoots on their tails. So you must have a tailing glove in your back pocket or somewhere so that you can grab him around the tail. And once you've got him around the tail, he's done. And they behave. They behave quite nicely for a photograph. and they're also really robust. So you can take your time when photographing a giant trevally. They stay calm, and they if there's a bit of blood around the gills or stuff like that, it generally clots quite easily. That fish won't die. They're probably the most robust fish you'll ever catch.
Very cool. Wow, you just created some incredible mental imagery for me. I'm sure our listeners are getting it as well. Let's jump into the next species. I think for me, species that's pretty neat and you can fish for in a lot of locations. So I'm interested to hear some tactics here. It's a fun fish to catch and can be extremely challenging once you hook them, and that's triggerfish.
Yeah, so in the Seychelles, we are lucky enough to get 3 different species which frequent the flats. The baby little guy, which is called the Bacasa, you can catch him on a bonefish fly, something really small. I mean, he doesn't really fight. Not much to talk about, just a beautiful photograph. And then we have 2 other species, which is obviously the moustache triggerfish, which is the giant, or called giant triggerfish, which has a black moustache on the top of its mouth, and it's mostly a orange and a black color. And then we have the yellow margin triggerfish, which is a beautiful sort of peachy yellow color, and they are the most beautiful, I think. Get slightly bigger than the moustache triggerfish on the flats, although the moustache triggerfish does grow bigger. You fish for both of them in a similar way, except that the moustache trigger loves broken coral and pancake flats and reef and those kind of things, whereas the yellow margin doesn't mind a bit of sand, white sand, and sort of more sandy pancake flats and so forth. And you fish them a very, very similar way. You are fishing either a 9 or a 10 weight rod. If you can get away with a 9 weight rod for presentation, it's better. But I like to fish a 10 weight rod just because you've got a little bit more power in pulling the fish. But they are very susceptible to line slap. So generally a 9 weight is going to be better for them.
And you need that. Do you need that extra power to just keep them out of the coral and the reef? Is that why you want that? Because they're not much runners.
So the power is. Yeah, well, the power is instantaneous, because they have their fins work in conjunction with each other. They are so powerful off the mark, and if you're going to have a problem with someone breaking off, it's generally just straight off the set, where the fish just turns around and heads off, and the guy doesn't have time, or the lady doesn't have time to sort of get ready and figure out what they do with their line, and they hold on to the line, and it's broken instantaneously. So that's quite important. And then the most important thing is obviously you don't really want that fish to create too much momentum. If he creates too much momentum and goes off the edge of the flat into the deeper water, he's gone. There's no way you're going to beat him. So you need to apply smooth, robust pressure, as much as you can, without breaking the leader.
Okay.
The thing with triggerfish is that they're obviously very spooky, so you can't fish heavy leader. So we fish anything between 15 and 25 pound fluorocarbon. I generally fish around 15 to 20. Most of the time I'm fishing 20 pounds, something that's a fluorocarbon that's nice and thin. And then at the end of that, we're fishing crustacean patterns with really strong hooks as well. Similar hooks to what you use for giant trevally, except that they're obviously much smaller. We're fishing either a number 2 hook, or something slightly smaller, like a size 4, something along those lines. But they really need to be strong.
Okay. Can you talk crunch
bars.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about how the fish are laying up and what you're looking for when they're feeding, and then your presentation there as well?
So triggerfish are always going to be fishing on the last 2 hours of the falling tide, on the low tide, and sort of the first 2 to 3 hours of the pushing tide. Obviously, if you're fishing around the neap tides when the water movement is slower, you get a lot more time to fish for them. So generally, I would prefer neap tides. Whereas spring tides, you have really, really sort of abrupt sessions, but you can have a lot more action in those hour-long sessions or 2-hour-long sessions. With the water being low, generally you're gonna spot them from a mile away because they'll be tailing. They'll have their tails out in the air, and they'll be waving you over. frantically feeding on whatever's underneath them, crunching on coral and crustaceans or whatever that they can find. When they're in that situation, it's generally a lot easier to catch them. The nice thing about that is when they're tailing, you can often catch them on overcast days. But generally, it's best to fish for them if you've got nice sunny days, and you can see them exactly which way they're pointing.
Mm-hmm.
The most difficult part about triggerfish is that you need to entice them in as little space as possible. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. If you can imagine, the bottom is made up of coral, turtle grass, and sand. So any fly, even though it's got a weed guard on it, has got a tendency to snag.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to try and picture, a scenario where you can get that fly to that fish, and within one strip, you can have that fly very close to its face for it to be able to see it, and then get it to respond to the movement of the fly and attack the fly, without having to do too much stripping and so forth, because you got a tendency to snag. So that's the hardest part about it. So generally you're going to spook a lot of them, because you're casting the fly, half a fly rod past them, so that the leader is halfway and down, and you have one strip and it comes to the fish, or you're going to go too close, or you're going to go too far, and you have to make too many strips for that fly to get in proximity of the fish, and then you snag the bottom. And when you snag the bottom, it's game over.
Yeah.
You're either going to have to wait for that fish to swim away and start feeding somewhere else, and you can go and pull it off and then cast again, or you're going to pull the fly and it's going to make a crack sound or whatever like that, and then the fish is going to spook.
Right.
Yeah, it's a fun game. And generally, to catch triggerfish, you need to have a lot of shots in a day. You can go with 30 or 40 shots at triggerfish in a day and not even get a hookup.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have 2 or 3 casts and they can eat it both times and have it in their mouths and they bite the hook off, or they crush the fly, or you fight them to your feet and they've bitten the hook in half and so forth. So it's fun in games. It really is Russian roulette.
A general fear of a lot of anglers that are freshwater anglers and then they go into saltwater is the fear of having to make these long extended casts. What are the average cast lengths that you're seeing for a lot of these species, or maybe focus on the triggerfish themselves?
Yeah, I mean, the casts don't have to be too far. It's obviously different scenarios. If you're fishing from the skiff and we're on the pole, you generally can get it much closer to a triggerfish, because you don't have the crunching sound on the flat.
Mm-hmm.
So your biggest issue is obviously if you're walking, you're standing on old broken coral that's dead coral, it makes a crunching sound. So obviously sound travels better underwater than it does above water. So the thing is that if you're within 20 yards 20 feet of the fish, you're gonna have to be really quiet. But you can present your fish even closer than that. I've caught fish with almost my leader in the rod.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all the different scenarios. You don't have to be concerned about having to make long casts in salt water. That you do not have to do. For giant trevally, you don't have to do it. Any kind of species, it sometimes helps, but a lot of the time it doesn't help, because if you can imagine, more line in the water is more trouble. You have to control that line.
Yep.
You have current, the current's moving, the line's moving. Sometimes you have a bit of wind, so you have wave action where it's moving that line, and you can't control it. So it's better to get the fly to a fish with a shorter line and be able to control it, than having a longer cast and not being able to control it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and these triggerfish, when you hook them, they're aiming to get down into little holes and break you off. Is that the experience that you have, and what are some of the ways that you go about managing that as well?
Yeah, so I mean, the longer the cast, you've got more chance of them disappearing off the flat and going into a hole. The closer you are, the better it is you can control it. So, same with the triggerfish, is that it's a gradual increase of drag to try and stop that fish as he goes towards his hole, holding that rod really, really high, and then just hoping he doesn't go in the hole. Sometimes the guides will run off after them and try and see if they can sort of corral them away from a hole or a piece of coral. But generally, it's a lot of luck. There's a lot of luck involved.
Yeah.
If they do go into the hole, it's not all over, because we can walk up the hole and we can actually feel inside the hole, feel which way they're facing, and generally they're facing away from you, And if you're able to push their trigger, which is the hard part of the anal fin, if you're able to be able to push the trigger down, you're able to pull them out. So sometimes you'll hook a triggerfish and you'll run 10 yards or 10 feet and go into a hole, and all you do is you walk up and put your hand inside there, grab him by the tail and pull him out. He's done.
All right, perfect. That is pretty cool. We've got time for one more species, and I really want to dive in because this is just fantastic information, Keith. I think full tutorial we're getting here today. Let's take a quick break, recognize our sponsors, and then when we get back, let's walk through one more species, and we'll leave that species as a surprise. So give us a moment, everyone, and we'll be right back. Angler's Coffee. We love fueling your next cast. We've been roasting coffee before coffee was cool. www.anglerscoffee.com. Dupafish. Coming soon. Pre-register now and get notified. www.dupafish, that's D-U-P-E, fish.com. And Togen's Fly Shop, a family-owned business for all your fly tying needs. That's Togen's Fly Shop, T-O-G-E-N-S, flyshop.com. All right, everyone, welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. We've got Keith on the line here. And Keith, you've really created some incredible mental images for me. I'm sure the audience as well. This has just been fantastic. A true tutorial on some saltwater species and fly fishing in general. Before we get really rolling, can you let the audience know how they can get a hold of you if they have interest in visiting one of your locations and going from there?
Yeah, you can get a hold of me on any one of our platforms. If you'd like to look at our destinations, you can Google Alphonse Fishing Company and look at our website. But if you have any questions on anything, I mean, anything saltwater or anything that I've done or any knots that I tie or destinations we go to, you can get a hold of me on Keith Rose Innes Fly Fishing on Instagram or Facebook. Or if you Google me on Keith Rose Innes Fly Fishing, I have a website which is www.rosinus.com. Send me messages or questions. I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, and we'll include all this in the show notes as well, everyone, so that you can get a hold of Keith as easily as possible. So with that being said, Keith, let's dive into the last species, something that has really become a very interesting species to see online. A lot of people have talked about recently, and that's the bumphead.
Yeah, the bumphead is quite a unique species in the sense that it's massive. You're obviously targeting these massive guys with light rods because they're quite spooky. So the ideal outfit is generally a 10 weight. It's what I fish. Same floating line, saltwater taper floating line can be a sort of a progressive taper. It needs to be geared around presentation. I would fish a quick taper fly rod, 9-foot rod with a real high quality saltwater reel. Obviously, you need to put some pressure on the fish. I fish the same kind of backing setup as I do for giant trevally, except that I tone it down from 80 pound to 50 pound. Same knots all the way through. And then when you get to the front of the fly line, braided loop is perfectly fine, or a welded loop is perfectly fine. And then what we generally do is we do a plaited leader or a twisted leader, 25-pound fluorocarbon to a perfection loop at the front or a blood knot. It doesn't really matter, to a crab pattern. The most important thing is that these fish are feeding and eating coral and crustaceans. So they're not a fish species who's going to turn and chase a fly. So you need to get it in a sort of general area where they're going to pass by, and it's almost a haphazard pickup of the fish. You'll swim by and see the fly on the bottom and pick it up and crunch it, and that's when you generally get your eats. But obviously, this
Keith, when I see photos of these bump heads, the photos that I've seen have been more groups of fish, like a smaller school of fish, and they look like they're cruising. Are they more of a schooling fish, or is that just a rarity and that's why I'm seeing that photo, or are they singles? How do they kind of move around and travel around the flats?
They generally in schools, in big schools. They obviously find sort of comfort in schools. They do react to each other. If one fish sort of spooks. All of them will spook together.
Mm-hmm.
So they very susceptible to sound. Any kind of sound, breaking of coral under the water, slapping of a fly in front of them, and so forth. They're very spooky as triggerfish are. But in a sense, they can be more spooky because there's a hell of a lot more eyes. When you got a school of 50 bumpheads and there's all those eyes, there's 100 eyes, and any false move, they're going to see you and then move off the flat. The one thing about them is that they like to be in shallow water, in the destinations that we fish, which is Farquhar. Generally, if you spook them, they'll go off to the deeper water, and if you leave them alone, they can come back on the flats. Mm. So you sometimes get a second chance. But the story about bumphead parrotfish is quite unique in the sense that, we fished for them for many years. I fished for them for 20 years. And a lot of the time, we didn't really know what we were fishing for. So we would hook these fish, and we didn't know whether we had foul hooked them or whether the fish had eaten the fly. The fish would generally disappear off into the blue yonder, and you would end up with a potted line or backing or something like that, or you would come back with a scale. So, it took a long time for us to figure out how to catch these flies. And in the early days, it was myself and Paul Boyce and Anna Mathieu in places like Farquhar, trying to figure out what are these fish eating? How do we present them? And 3-4 years passed, seeing them, presenting to them, unable to get them to eat on a regular basis, thinking, well, they don't eat a fly. Eventually, sort of toning it down to a stage where we had a trip where we went out and we were seeing significant amounts of them, and we had refined it down to the fact that they are eating crustaceans, and you just had to get that fly right in front of them, and the scenario had to be correct. I was with a gentleman, and Paul Boyce was with a gentleman the day before. He hooked one, didn't manage to land it. I hooked one that day, didn't manage to land it. And eventually all the stars aligned, and we managed to land the first bumpy on fly, which is around, I think, 2005. And then we knew by holding this bumphead that they eat it, because, you can see that there is the mouth. It's got a beak, but in the corner of the mouth, it's got two fleshy areas where you can quite easily get purchase. Mm-hmm. So we knew that we could catch them. Funny enough, the first bumpy ever caught in fly, the only thing we have of is a photograph of its eye, because I held the fish, and when I passed to the client, he was holding it, and I grabbed the camera to take a photograph, and as it happened, it hit him in the face, knocked his sunglasses off, and the fish almost landed on me, and all I got was a photograph of its eye. So it took a bit of time for us to actually get the first successful photograph of a bumpy being held by an angler. But yeah, it was a great experience, and obviously, I'm lucky enough, just sheer luck, to be credited with the first guided bumphead on fly, even though we had hooked many before that. Yeah. And since then, obviously we find the technique. We know that they like white and orange and tan colored flies, and it's all about just getting the fly in the right place. The unfortunate part of fishing for bumphead is that you do sometimes foul hook them because they're in shallow water, they're passing by the line, there's lots of them. But you can tell instantaneously if you've foul hooked him or you've hooked him in the mouth.
And then when you're putting that fly in front of them, how are you moving that crab pattern, or what is it that you think is kind of in that movement that's triggering that fish to get after it?
So generally the fish are moving slowly as they tail. And so what I like to do is I like to pick a sort of a group of them which are nice and tight, and see how they're moving, and find a clump of coral or sand or area where I can place the fly without snagging. And then what I'll do is I'll place the fly in that area and let the fish swim through it. You don't move the fly, you just stay in contact with the fly and just watching them to see if there's any movements of the fish turning sideways to pick up the fly and so forth. And it's a very visual experience, mm-hmm. Whereas you sometimes can see them turn sideways and eat that fly. And as you see the fly line moving, you obviously set, and then you're in for a hell of a fight.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds like a game of patience for sure. Wow.
But you take into account that you've got a 10-weight rod and you've got a 50-pound bumphead who's going to stay with his troop. So wherever the troop goes, it's going to go, and you're pulling as hard as you can with 25-pound fluorocarbon, and you're just praying that fish stays on the flat, which they don't often stay on the flat. So you need to get after him, get on the boat and chase him and get him into deeper water and try and fight him up and down, so that if there is coral, which he definitely will go for, you're able to sort of unwrap the fish if you get that opportunity.
Yeah.
In the beginning of fishing for bumpies, you pray for a small fish, and then once you've caught a few small fish, then you tend to try and target.
I got this experience now under my belt to feel at least a little bit more confident.
Yeah, and if you can target them when they're in the middle of the flat, and there's sort of a couple of 100 yards on either side of them before they're able to get to the deeper water, that's ideal.
Wow, it just sounds incredible. I got to keep going. I'm enjoying this so much, Keith. I want to hear some of your tactics and recommendations for hunting permit. There are so many people out there that look at that fish as their end goal accomplishment in fly fishing. So let's chat about that real quick.
So Indo-Pacific permit, or permit as we call them, they've really been the bane of our life, of a guide's life for many years. In the Seychelles, the Indian Ocean, we never really had the game plan on how to catch them. We use various different flies like spawning shrimps and gotchas and merkins and Velcro crabs and all sorts of patterns which weren't really working, which didn't really work. It was in those days was the fish of 1,000,000 casts versus the fish of 1,000 casts. And quite a few years ago we kind of evolved the flexo crab, which used to be, I think it was called the Orvis crab, which was a flexo body material with the rubber legs that went through it. It was tied more in a bulky style, really big, slightly different, sort of shape. And what we done is we refined that pattern to a fly pattern which we call the Alflexo. It's spelled ALPH, like Alphonse Flexo crab.
Gotcha. All right.
Where we reduced the size of the mesh right down. We made micro different versions of it. We put a cactus chenille leg through it, and we weighted the fly. We killed the fly to create more of a realistic pattern. And this pattern is now world renowned. People are fishing them all over the place. For permit in Bahamas, in Mexico, in Cuba. For blue bastards in Australia and Indo-Pacific permit in Australia. So it really has taken off in a sense that that the pattern may be tweaked in various different ways for those different species is really put Indo-Pacific permit back on the map. So we generally target Indo-Pacific permit. They love mottled bottoms. They sometimes will enjoy white sand with rays and so forth, feeding on rays, but they really do love mottled bottoms. Any kind of bottom which can entice crustaceans to live. And I'm a firm believer that when I'm fishing for Indo-Pacific permit, you need to make that fish see the fly. Often you can present that fly 3-4 times to that fish without him even seeing it. So I won't lead the fish too far. I'll generally lead the fish by half a rod length at maximum. If there's a bit of current, if you can swing it into the fish, even better. But you really got to get that fish to see the fly. And the one thing we've learned about in the Pacific permit is you don't want to fish a static fly, not at all. I know that when you fish for Atlantic permit, sometimes you'll fish a static fly, different scenarios and stuff. We want to make that fish chase the fly. So it's a nice, constant, 3-foot strip or 2-foot strip, nice and constant, just staying in contact with that fly, making sure that you never lose contact with the fly, because Indo-Pacific permit inhales the fly, and as quick as they inhale it, they'll exhale it. So they obviously use their rib cage to inhale it. So you can be stripping and feel as if you're in contact with that crab, but you're not. And within a second, you've had a bump. And you think, oh, he's eaten it. And you lift the rod or you pull the rod, whatever. It's not him eating the fly. It's him exhaling the fly. And you're feeling the bump as it comes out of his mouth. So we generally would prefer to have a faster strip than a slower strip. It's cat and mouse. You've got to entice that fish to eat the fly. And we don't like to present the same fly more than twice. So if I cast a white Alflexo to the fish, and you've put it past him twice and he hasn't reacted to it, I'll change it immediately to a tan fly and put it back to the fish. If it doesn't take the tan one, I'll take that away and I'll put like a a white or clear fly with a orange eye, or I put a little bit of weight on it, and you keep fishing that fly. If you're able to have more than 1 or 2 or 3 casts, sometimes you get as many as 10 casts to a fish.
Oh, wow.
But I don't want them to see that same fly over and over again. I want them to see different fly. And eventually, if that fish is feeding and he hasn't spooked, and you manage to get the fly in the right place, he's going to react to that fly. And like any other species, now if you're able to get 2 or 3 Indo-Pacific permit feeding together, you've got that competitiveness. You generally get a better reaction. But still, even with the Alflexo, you got to have many, many good casts at them for them to turn around and eat it. It's like it's permit fishing at the end of the day. They just 99% of the time, they don't react to the fly, or they put their middle fin up, or you spook them, or it's just the most frustrating but rewarding experience ever.
Well, Keith, it's been absolutely enlightening speaking with you today. You're a wealth of knowledge. It's clearly evident that you've dedicated your life to fly fishing and preservation and really mastering your craft. It's been, like I said, a hell of an experience for me. I'm sure our listeners are enjoying it as well. I would absolutely love to get you back on this podcast again at some time, maybe to talk about some of the freshwater species that you targeted either in South Africa or Russia, etc. But in the meantime, thank you so much. And let's wrap it up for today. If you guys want to get a hold of Keith, again, he listed out a number of areas. Alphonse Fishing Company is where you can get a hold of him, or on Instagram at Keith Rosen's Fly Fishing. His contact information is in our show notes. Keith, thanks so much, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. Thanks to listeners for listening to my story. And the most important thing to remember is that it's not me, it's all about the destination. And I've just been lucky enough to experience the Seychelles.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Keith.